So, following on from the ideas about panic and how people experience panic and the sort of basic overview, I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about some of the ideas that I think are important for recovery work with panic. And I will cover a few ideas here. So this is not exhaustive, and feel free to write any questions below about specific aspects of panic that you'd like me to talk about. I think, first of all, to say the evidence base for panic recovery is primarily cognitive behavioral therapy, and there are specific CBT protocols for panic. What I'm going to talk about is what's often called third wave CBT, which is really when mindfulness and compassion and values and other ideas have been integrated into CBT. It's a complicated topic of how CBT and third wave CBTs relate, because in many ways they've co-developed and in some ways they've developed independently in certain areas, but that's a big topic. We'll just say for simplicity, what I'm talking about here is third wave CBT ideas, and primarily acceptance and commitment therapy, also compassion-based approaches like compassion focused therapy. Um, and so there's a lot of overlap with the more traditional CBT protocols. I guess some of the differences are that the CBT panic protocols will often do a lot of cognitive restructuring work when we reappraise our thoughts. So we sort of rationally challenge the thoughts that perhaps drive panic and the cognitive distortions, the problematic ways we overgeneralize or use black and white thinking and other cognitive distortions that really fuel the beliefs that challenge or exacerbate panic. Um, Sometimes there is breath protocols within the CBT. So we might do certain things to control breath to reduce the hyperventilation issues that might be driving the O2 oxygen CO2 imbalance in the blood that can cause some of the symptoms that, you know, increase panic, like the dizziness and the tingling and the heart palpitations and the suffocation or hyperventilating, different breath impacts. Sometimes distraction is included, so the options of distracting yourself in some protocols, progressive muscle relaxation sometimes in the older protocols. So CBT is this large umbrella of evidence-based therapies, and even within CBT, there are lots of different approaches to panic, and some people will talk about exposure protocols and other people will talk about behavioral experiments. And there's a lot of overlap, but everyone's sort of planting their flag and claiming their sort of approach. I guess I've been inspired by people like David Barlow, which are some of the real original CBT people that have really integrated third wave ideas into CBT, and they are using some of the traditional CBT cognitive restructuring together with the mindfulness tools. So, without wanting to make this too complicated, there are these additional aspects to some of the CBT protocols that ACT doesn't emphasize, and I don't emphasize because acceptance and commitment therapy ACT was the most helpful thing for me in my recovery from panic, from anxiety more generally, from OCD, from depersonalization, from depression. And so I really emphasize that. But of course, we're going to recommend you try, perhaps the CBT protocols first, or you work with someone who integrates CBT and third wave approaches. A lot of people do that. They, started in CBT, but they additionally use the ACT and DBT and mindfulness-based CBT and things like that alongside it. So that would be a good option to approach this so that you can try the evidence-based protocols. I mean, we'll explain why some of these aspects of it I don't think align so well with ACT and what might be helpful with ACT, but you could certainly try them first, and then if they're not helpful, then work other things. I mean, for example, the hyperventilation side of things, I found that I tried lots of the breathing ideas. A lot of protocols will say that we are over breathing and the oxygen level has gone higher, and that has thrown off our, sort of body physiology, and it can produce some of the hyperventilation symptoms that add into panic. But I found when I tried to control my breathing, it wasn't helpful. Actually, it all became quite compulsive, and I had a lot of hyper awareness of breathing, which is an OCD theme where you get very locked on your breathing and locked on this feeling of air hunger, where you feel like you're sort of suffocating, and sometimes you can feel that all day long. And no amount of breath control helps. In fact, I would argue it's a compulsion that really adds to the problem. So I think there are some people that use breath and find it helpful, and I'm not trying to undermine that when that is the case. And I do think breathing can be a nice relaxation practice outside of the panic times. So just like yoga or any kind of body work can be very relaxing, but the more intense your panic symptoms, the less you can really use any of those tools to regulate that emotional system. So that's kind of how I see breathing. I found it much easier to sort of try to not be so hyper aware of breathing, and if anything, relax a little bit, and just let my body do what it wants to do. If my breath is shallower, it's shallower. If it feels tight, it feels tight. I know I can feel that feeling of breath hunger and continue to talk, continue to focus on life and accept that feeling, even if it sticks around. And that has been far more helpful to me than any amount of deep breathing or, controlling the breath in any sort of way. I think there's evidence that I've seen some research that people with panic sometimes have a stronger suffocation sensitivity in their brain. So when you're in that panic mode, any amount of constriction in your breath becomes sort of triggering. And really, the antidote is to get more comfortable feeling out of breath and to feel the breath hunger and not see it as something catastrophic. See it as something you can sort of slow down. I mean, we'll talk about some of the stuff when you're talking that I think is useful, but generally the acceptance of that has been far more helpful than breathing. Distraction, well, okay, distraction can work with a certain amount of activation, but often it's just putting off the problem till later, or there was lots of levels of panic. There's no chance I could have distracted myself. I mean, I tried that all through my early days in school, and sometimes I could distract myself thinking about something I was interested in or something like that. But whenever panic was bad, no chance, nothing I could do to distract myself. Acceptance was far more helpful. Progressive muscle relaxation, if that's added in, um, I think that's a great practice. It's good to learn to relax, but again, not in the moment of panic. That will all become compulsive and like, why aren't I relaxing? If I do this, gosh, I feel more tense, I feel more anxious. So I would see that more as a practice to develop for life, to learn to relax more, rather than something to do to try and control panic. Cognitive restructuring, reappraisal. I mean, I think to some extent we're always doing some reappraisal with panic because we're learning this is a symptom I can tolerate rather than a catastrophic signal. But I think there's a limit to that cognitive restructuring. I found really my brain as a OCD brain can really debate anything, any rational reappraisal. My brain could find an example, if you have the fear of dying from panic, you can say, well, it's never killed me before. I've had all these panic attacks. We know this fits with the symptomology of panic. And yet your brain can find examples where people do have heart attacks and they do get wrongly diagnosed and all this sort of stuff. Or, going mad, your brain can say, well, I haven't gone mad so far, but maybe I will. Maybe this is all about to happen. So I just found my brain could always out argue me with any cognitive restructuring. Now, in CBT, they might say, well, don't do that in the moment of struggle. And that, that could be the case. We need some psychoeducation. Maybe we need some degree of cognitive flexibility here, and that can be very much part of ACT. But I just don't think it's the main mechanism of change here. It might be helpful for some people, and maybe there's a personality style, but I found it became stuff my mind brought into the mental compulsions and the rumination and the worry and the debate and I could not use it when I was panicky, and your mind can blank so much you just can't think like this. You can control your attention, your action to some degree still, but you can't always think so rationally. So that was my sort of hesitation with that. But again, I'm not saying it's not helpful at all, and maybe this varies from person to person as well. For me, I found an ACT approach to be much more helpful. And so, we certainly could start with general life stresses and trying to, the CBT protocols will often say, look at your lifestyle. Are there any aspects of that that are exacerbating panic? And I think that's always a good thing to do. Am I looking after myself? Am I trying to sleep enough, even if I'm having difficulty with sleeping? Am I going to bed on time? And, trying to practice good sleep hygiene. Am I, eating a decent diet? Am I, hydrated? Am I, exercising? Am I socially connected? Am I engaged in meaningful work? Am I managing my stress levels and the way I schedule and structure my time and the way I draw upon social support? Do I have any systemic issues, any interpersonal conflict, or stresses from being a minority group, for example, anything like that, where I might need to look structurally at my life, where I'm located, who I'm surrounded by, am I socially supported, all of that. So I think that is key for all of us with mental health difficulties. And we could talk more about how you would do that, but hopefully a good therapist will look at your life and help you problem solve and help you make sure that, life is structured in such a way that it is most supportive to our recovery. Um, I like to have an option of a foundational level. As I don't assume everyone can go straight into act skills, straight into exposure, work with panic. I think some people need to get this sort of baseline stability in there first, and then from there we can move into the kind of act skills and then into the exposure work. So this could mean um, using the ideas that we have in the crisis coping videos. So on the channel, we've got a video on crisis coping where I really work through, some of the things I recommend when we're basically in a constant panic state where, we might be in that high anxiety all day long, having many panic attacks in a day, and it's very difficult to even start to think about challenging it, to sit still and practice. If you're in that sort of place, obviously you should be working with a therapist and you need support in that place. But, these videos, these ideas are to complement and support that. So working with your therapist to develop those crisis coping skills. And a lot of that is having a really good behavioral plan for the day. So you plan and structure the whole day, half an hour by half an hour by an hour, whatever, and you've planned lots of supportive actions, and then you're using the drop-in anchor for overwhelm skill, which again is on this channel. You can find that easily. And that's really an adaptation to the ACT tool drop-in anchor that Russ Harris developed, where we very briefly acknowledge what's going on inside and then spend a lot more time getting into our body and a lot more time engaging externally. And we're doing perhaps things that are more cognitively demanding or physically demanding or self-soothing in some way. So we're choosing those actions to engage in that are supportive. And we get better at that initial stabilization stage so that basically our days are well structured and planned, lots of supportive actions, and we're using these skills to help. And the panic may not be gone, and the hyperarousal might not be gone, but we feel like I'm to some degree able to handle it, to stay focused on life and goals, and I can get through a day. And once you've got to that point, and not everyone has to do that, that's people who are really in this overwhelm, hyperarousal, high levels of panic, and it feels scary to think about exposure, scary to think about skill practice, that first stage. A lot of people don't need to do that. And again, working with your therapist to figure this out. For other people, we can go straight into the ACT skills, starting with dropping anchor, maybe going deeper into diffusion for the mental aspects of panic, acceptance to the physiological and emotional components, present moment focus to be able to focus whilst triggered. So we're building up these skills, and then we are then applying and learning that through exposure practice. And we're developing exposure hierarchies. We're doing situational exposure out in the world. We're maybe doing imaginal exposure, mentally rehearsing difficult situations or thinking about the panic or memories. And we might be doing interoceptive exposure, which I'll talk about later as well, which is where we try and stimulate the body to show similar symptoms to panic. And then we practice our skills with those symptoms, which is very much part of CBT. All of these levels of exposure will be part of CBT. So there's a lot of overlap here between an ACT approach and a traditional CBT approach to panic. We're just prioritizing acceptance more, focus on values, not trying to get symptom reduction as the main goal. We're getting emotional acceptance, psychological flexibility so that I can focus whilst I'm in an anxious state, and I can accept more higher levels of anxiety and stay really engaged with life and functioning really well in the panic and anxiety. And then the side effect is the symptoms come down rather than I'm doing a panic protocol just to get rid of panic. And all the time I'm going, has it gone yet? Has it gone yet? Oh, I didn't feel panicky. Oh no, I felt panicky again. Oh my God. So we're trying to do exposure with more an acceptance and a present moment and a values frame. And then we're working with any barriers that come up as well. So, and again, assuming we're not dealing with complexities of PTSD, trauma, complex PTSD, there might be adaptations to be done. Hopefully, these ideas are still useful, but you'll need to work with a therapist to figure out the adaptations for trauma and what needs to be done there. And working on the barriers such as shame, such as the way our mind might resist this process, things like that. Really, what we're trying to do with ACT is remove the layers of struggle and resistance with our ACT skills that then turn panic into just high levels of anxiety. So you have anxiety and high levels of anxiety, and then you start to hyper focus on it. You start to mentally predict the worst case scenarios of death, madness, loss of control, embarrassment, being stuck in that state forever. And then we might get additional emotions about the emotion. We then start doing physical safety behaviors, and we might have catastrophic images, and we're doing mental compulsions. We're sort of playing out how to escape, worrying about the outcome, analyzing and arguing and worrying and debating in our brain. And all of these layers add up to generate the panic attack and intensify it. And if we can peel away those layers, we can just have some unpleasant anxiety sensations, maybe some difficult thoughts, but we have distance and space from them, much more attention to focus on values. And really, we've turned the struggle switch down. So Russ Harris talks about a struggle switch where more we struggle with emotion, the more it amplifies, the more we turn that struggle switch down with our ACT skills, then the less it amplifies. And the difficulty is sometimes that struggle switch is on automatically and we don't even realize it's on. And so we have to train to reduce it. An example of this would be often the way we monitor our symptoms is very automatic. And so we have to learn to not monitor anymore, to turn that struggle switch down and instead be externally focused. Um, And so once we've used our act skills, so this is going to be from this channel, it's going to be working on dropping anchor. Then we might do a bit of the diffusion practices or the acceptance practices to focus specifically on thoughts or feelings, or we might just do dropping anchor, and that's more than enough to work with. We might do some dipping in and out the stream if there's a lot of mental worry about panic. And um, as I said earlier, in panic disorder, we're often doing a lot of worry about the next one. Um, and then we might be, once we've got those act skills in place, including connection to values, connection to workability, so the motivational skills to get our motivation up high to challenge OCD, to challenge panic. And we're assuming that we understand panic and we've got all the psychoeducation in place and we understand the safety behaviors and the different mental compulsions that are added into it all. We're then using those skills to build up this capacity to then face panic through exposure work. And, we're going to typically draft out how do we step by step face panic. In the newer exposure work and inhibitory learning, sometimes there's more a menu, and we're not talking about the graded steps to exposure that much. But I like, especially with more severe clients, doing these sort of gradual steps towards it. And the first step on that hierarchy could be just practicing skills, the ACT skills, and then the next step could be working with some of the memories of panic attacks, or mentally rehearsing going through panic. The next steps could be doing some physical exercise and trying to get the heart rate up and breathing up and trying to get more comfortable with that. Then we might be going, okay, what's the smallest step I can do? Just leaving the house, or just going one stop on a bus, or even smaller steps, depending on how severe the panic is. And that can be really good to work with a therapist to really understand the gradual pacing. In ACT, we're going to tie this very much to values, and we're going to think, what is the life I want to build? What are my core values towards myself and others? How am I not living those because of panic? How can I identify ways to make my hierarchy very tied into those values? So that might be, I value social connection, but yet I'm not really seeing anyone because of panic. Okay, I'm going to go and see a friend in a park as step one, and building from there. And so I'm giving very general advice in this video, but obviously it very much depends where you are in terms of symptom severity, and the speed of the hierarchy will depend on that. If you've just had a few panic attacks and you kind of know what it is, and there's high insight and high motivation to challenge it, you might be able to move very quickly and actually build up an acceptance of panic very fast, and not be experiencing panic in the same way anymore, just experiencing high anxiety and pushing out there. For other people where they are more emotionally vulnerable to the high degrees of panic, like I said in the first video, they're more the emotional burns victims, the nervous system is louder, the catastrophic beliefs are more believable, the sense of self-efficacy is lower. All of these things that make it easy to face panic are lower. Okay, we're going to have to very, very gradually face this and build up the skills to face it and do exposure at a level where I can still access my ACT skills. We don't want to do it at a level where I've lost it and I'm just in the panic cycle. And I like the idea of this, of Deborah Lee from Compassion Focused Therapy, where she talks about in trauma, you can move very quickly or more quickly to exposure work if someone has these train tracks laid down in their life. So a sense of secure attachment from their childhood. They've had a good enough childhood. They've built some inner resilience from that. They've learned that they are self-efficacious, and they can control their life and they can do difficult things. Well, that kind of person, you can often move to exposure much quickly. Whereas if you are someone that has had a lot of childhood trauma. You might be biologically vulnerable to more intense emotions. You've had more traumas in your life. Well, the train tracks aren't laid down. So if you go straight to exposure, the train will go off the tracks and we're going to experience hyperarousal dissociation, more intense ongoing symptoms, not a typical improvement in our situation. We're going to kind of get worse in the panic. Well, the antidote to that is we've got to lay down the train tracks through therapy, through skill practice, through a much more gradual approach until those train tracks feel more solid to go and do the more challenging exposure over time. And it might be a more gradual process, and it might be, weeks, months, years rather than weeks and months to recovery. Um, and we don't want to underestimate ourselves, but we need to get that pacing right. I think ACT doesn't assume that everyone can just let go of the mental compulsions and not be struggling with feelings. It kind of assumes that a lot of people white knuckle through exposure. Steve Hayes himself actually developed acceptance and commitment therapy out of his own panic disorder, and he had been trained in behavioral therapy and he was using a lot of the CBT protocols, and he found that he was actually struggling with all of them. He was sort of trying to relax his way out of panic or breathe his way out of panic or self-talk his way out of panic or do exposure and kind of force his way through, and he found it was like getting in contact with this stuff and then learning emotional acceptance through the mindfulness tools of ACT that was really helpful. So it's actually a very interesting journey of panic disorder that led to ACT. So you might want to look at Steve Hayes's book Liberated Mind, or just hear him on a few podcasts talking about panic. I think in ACT, we're assuming that there's a lot going on in our mind leading up to the panic event. So, panic disorder has a lot of preoccupation and worry about the next panic attack and a lot of thinking about how to avoid it. And so we want to use our diffusion skills to interrupt that. We might be safety planning and going into places and always looking for the ways to escape. And we want to try and reduce that so that we go into our triggering situations and we're more aware of what the actual building is like, and we're not doing all that avoidance and mental compulsion to try and control it. We might be worrying, ruminating, planning, imagining, testing. There might be a lot of self-criticism, a lot of resentment, might be self-reassuring in a way that just feeds the sense that we can't handle it. So we want to target those internal thought loops and try to use diffusion and over time build up to being able to do the practice dipping in and out the stream, which you'll see on this channel with all that mental activation. We want to be very good at accepting these sensations in the body. So all the symptoms, all the symptoms we talked about earlier, the air hunger and choking, the shallow breathing or whatever it does to our breathing, the heart pounding, the tightness in the chest, the feeling of skip beats, the shaking, the tension, the sweating, dizziness, faintness, nausea, needing the bathroom, feeling depersonalized, racing mind, blank mind, perceptual disturbances in what we're seeing, hearing, our sense of the world. Um, any of these symptoms, we want to be using our ACT skills to be able to acknowledge and observe and then refocus on life and maybe notice and name them or just acknowledge them. So we're using our acceptance practices that, again, you can look at this channel for lots of advice on how to accept body sensations, um, and how to work with what's showing up there at the body. And then once we're good at diffusing those thoughts and accepting those sensations and feelings, then we're doing more and more exposure, and we're practicing those skills as the thoughts and feelings are generated in the exposure, and then we're engaging in the exposure because it's a values-based exposure. So hopefully we're focusing back and engaging with people and on what we're doing. So just to recap, I see a progression using ACT for panic recovery as being building a foundation or stabilization if we're in very intense panic disorder and it's hard to even think about practicing skills, doing exposure work. So that's stage one, and that is using the crisis or overwhelm coping skills. That you can see my ideas on that in this YouTube channel, or you can use something like dialectical behavior therapy to complement it, or other therapies that might give some skills to sort of cope with crisis. I like to use the sort of ACT ideas that I put in the crisis coping skills together with dropping anchor for overwhelm. So this slightly adapted version of dropping anchor, which I learned from Russ Harris, and I found useful with clients that are really struggling with overwhelming symptoms. So that's step one. And we could say stabilization, or we could say, overwhelm coping skills. And then stage two is typical ACT progression, learning diffusion, acceptance, present moment engagement, connection to values, committed action, flexible sense of self. So all the typical ACT processes. I like dropping anchor to train this. So Russ Harris's idea of dropping anchor, which you can find in the Happiness Trap or on this channel. And you could use other protocols from ACT. You could use the ideas from Get Out of Your Mind into Your Life or other ACT books. But yeah, you'll see the way I like to do it on this channel. So building these skills and then applying these skills in exposure therapy. And this could be starting with actually the skills being exposure, then imaginal exposure to triggering situations or memories. It could then be moving into interoceptive exposure and then doing more situational exposure. So, interoceptive exposure, trying to bring up unpleasant body sensations. My favorite way to do this is exercise. I think it's the best way. We could talk about some of the other options, and um, then doing more situational exposure. So deciding on how gradual we want the hierarchy to be. If we're feeling very overwhelming emotions and it's very distressing to challenge it, it could be less steps if we're feeling more confident and like those train tracks are laid from the metaphor earlier on. And you can work with a therapist on every stage. Um, and then we're really trying to go after the compulsions and safety behaviors using our ACT skills. So really going after the mental compulsions, the threat monitoring of symptoms and the acceptance of emotions. Um, and then really having a list of all the safety behaviors as well, all the compulsions we're doing physically, all the avoidance, all of the control strategies, all of the stuff we mentioned in part one. So getting a really clear list of that. And then trying to gradually reduce that over time. So either reduce the amount we're doing things, either the time, if we're spending lots of time on compulsion. So finding a way where we can gradually reduce all of that until we're really doing very few, if not zero, safety behaviors and compulsions, whilst being compassionate, understanding that it's not always as easy to drop everything, and that can be a complicated, difficult process. So if we're moving towards values, if life is expanding, if we're starting to do more behaviorally, to me, that's a big win. And if there's some compulsions going on, okay, we can master that. We can refine that over time and get that better and better. For me, it's not like I dropped everything immediately. I started trying to do more. Started trying to work on acceptance, but I was still doing mini avoidances. And I think, to be honest, everyone does little bits of experiential avoidance, as we would call it in ACT, where we're avoiding uncomfortable, difficult situations. I think everyone does some degree of that in their life. So we don't need to get perfectionist and sort of OCD about the recovery and treatment. We can do our best job to gradually reduce that stuff more and more over time. So just to say a little bit more on some of the exposure strategies. So Imaginal, I think, is a great place to work. For some people, imaginal exposure won't be very challenging. So, any degree of visualizing triggering situations, visualizing memories of having panic before, certain words, phrases, doing exposure to the catastrophic thoughts, to the worries, to certain triggering words, triggering phrases. I think for a lot of people, that might not be so difficult, might be very easy. And in fact, people will often say it doesn't really trigger me. It can still be a good place to begin. There'll be some people where that's very intense. And like I said, we need to do the stabilization stage first before doing that. But imaginal exposure, I like mentally rehearsing the panic inducing situations and imagining getting through them despite being very intense anxiety. So you could listen to the mental rehearsal practices I have on this channel. There's a mental rehearsal practice, and you could use that to do that kind of exposure. You can do exposure to the memories. Sometimes even thinking about times of panic will induce some anxiety sensations and stuff. It all depends where we are in how intense the baseline symptoms are, really. Um, so we can work that imaginal exposure. We can do the interoceptive exposure. Now, there's lots of interoceptive exposure written in many of the books, and if you Google online, you'll get lots of examples. Now, this is another area where you find a lot of people don't find this so helpful because they'll do something like breathing through a straw and they'll go, well, it doesn't feel like the panic. I don't, okay, it feels marginally uncomfortable, but it's nothing like when I have a real panic attack. And spinning in a chair, this pretend dizziness or this induced dizziness is not the same as when it comes on in the triggering situations or purposeful hyperventilation, breathing rapidly for a minute or longer, with the guidance of a therapist and assuming no health, for all these interoceptive, you need to be signed off by your doctor and make sure you don't have any physical health challenges. But what I find with a lot of people is they say it's just not like real panic. And you could say, well, that's okay. You could think of it as a real mild type of exposure. So we are going to generate some physical sensations if we, breathe through a straw and it's harder to breathe, or we do, some of the other stuff. It's going to induce some body sensations that we can then practice acceptance of. We can diffuse the judgment of it. We can diffuse the thought that's saying, this isn't like real panic. Okay, I notice judgment. I might have mild breath symptom or sensations. Okay, I can work acceptance with that. And it's just an intro way of training skills. But a lot of people find it, that that's about the main value. Now, there are exceptions. There are people that certainly doing any kind of interoceptive exposure will trigger some panic symptoms or higher anxiety. And then, okay, that could be a very useful way to practice. The way I like to get around this is physical activity is a great way to do this because we all know we should be training cardio and strength and doing things that get our heart rate right up and the different zones, heart rate zones of training. We want to get our heart rate up to a certain level. Zone 2 is fairly comfortable, but it might be challenging for some people with panic. But certainly the more intense zones, heart rate zones, where you do more interval training, or you do the certain protocols like the Norwegian 4x4, where you're very intensely doing an exercise like cycling or whatever it is for 4 minutes, and then you're resting for, I forget the exact details of the protocol, but 3 minutes or something like that. And then you do 4 minutes again, very intense, and 3 minutes. Things like that will typically get more intense body sensations. And for some people with panic, they're avoiding exercise, they're really worried about their heart rate. Same with weightlifting, the kind of raising blood pressure, the intensity of, say, leg training, particularly, or other things can induce some pretty intense body sensations that people struggle with and might become hyper aware of. So that's a good place to train. And even if that doesn't trigger you, if it still doesn't give you anxiety or panic, it definitely will give you intense body sensations, especially if you're pushing yourself at quite a hard level. You're really getting up there. I mean, you need to do your research and understand how to train and perhaps get advice on this if you haven't done any training, physical training. But if you know your level of fitness, what you're capable of doing. It's all signed off, and you know that that's safe to do. And maybe you've exercised before and you know what you're doing. Then, yeah, gradually pushing up in intensity suitable with your fitness until you're getting to levels where it's quite intense. And you are pushing yourself hard, and it's hard to keep going at that intensity, or you're starting to, not have many reps in reserve for weight training or other things like that. You might even be training close to failure. These sorts of things are going to induce some pretty intense body sensations. It's hard, for a lot of us, it's quite hard to train. They say that sometimes you think you're training full physical intensity, you're really at 30%. So, there's always often space to push things a little bit more intensely, gradually, and that's a great place to train these accepted skills. And I think we all should be doing that for our mental and physical health anyway. And I found that very helpful. I had times where, I had panic attacks through exercise, or, I was very hyper aware of my breathing and my heart rate, or dizziness or other things, or pain. And, so I think there's lots of beneficial things from physical training that can be very helpful. I think it's like the best interoceptive exposure, really. Um, and it can be a values-based thing as well. So let's imagine we've got the skills down, the imaginal exposure work we're practicing on, that we're maybe doing some interoceptive. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do those other interoceptive exposures. You could play around with those with the therapist and, do some of the breathing stuff, or some, depending on what your anxiety sensations are that are difficult. But then exercise is going to be something I would really recommend. But then we're moving into situations. So as I said, we're trying to think what's the level of intensity. If I've got full-blown panic disorder, agoraphobia, it's hard for me to leave my house. We're going to be starting very gradual. It might even just be going out of your door. I've done that with clients before, where it's literally just go out the door, is step one. Or even that can be hard. Even getting out of your bed can be hard, depending on if depression's there and the level of intensity. So you work out that gradation where it is challenging, but it's not so intense that you get a skills breakdown where you can't really practice your act skills anymore. With the caveat, everyone can be in such a difficult place where it's really hard to practice act skills full stop. And I've been there in the past. And at that point, you've got to just do some of the behavioral stuff in the crisis coping. But assuming you're not there, you find a level of intensity that you can do and push into, and you work your skills. And I think about sort of three levels of skills during exposure. Level one is you might really slow right down and drop anchor, and you take time to diffuse. You might notice and name your thoughts quite a few times. You might do some of the acceptance practices where you really zoom through the whole body, and then zoom in on a difficult sensation, and you work acceptance on that difficult sensation, and then you expand and engage your attention into life. So you could look at the name practice and the acceptance practices I have on this channel to get a sense of that. So you really, in this stage one, you're taking 2 or 3 minutes, 5 minutes, even 10 minutes, even. It obviously depends on the situation, because certain situations you can't really tune out and practice your skills because you're talking to people or having to perform. But ultimately, that first level is like extended skills. Then the second level is you crunch that down. So it's a much briefer drop in anchor you're doing for 10, 20, 30 seconds max. And you're doing that whenever the panic is starting to distract and overwhelm you and pull you out of what you're doing. And you do the drop in anchor until you can refocus and accept the panic a bit more, and be focused and engaged in what you're doing. And then the final level is the skills are really done in response to the panic pulling you out of the present moment. So, say I'm in I don't know, in a big public area like a theater or something, and I get panic in that environment. If I can engage in the play or the film or whatever I'm doing, whatever I'm watching, the comedy gig, the music gig, if I can stay focused on that and I can have a high degree of acceptance of anxiety, then that's good. I don't need to do more than that. But as I'm engaging in the gig or the show, and I start to think, oh God, I'm panicking. And so my thoughts are going, my hyper awareness is on the symptoms, and I'm threat monitoring the symptoms. Okay, I acknowledge that, acknowledge the thoughts, the feelings, and then I refocus back on the gig. And I'm doing that very quickly, and I'm using that as I need to. So that's the sort of three levels of, basically how long we're spending on the skills, how much we're just prioritizing being engaged versus how much we're diffusing, accepting, and refocusing. Um, and you can't be aware of multiple things really in one go. If you look at the research on the brain has limited processing power, so you can't really be working in depth acceptance of panic symptoms while simultaneously listening to a play and following the storyline. So this is where you're sort of toggling in a way back and forth. You're focused on what you're engaging in, and then you're using the acceptance skills briefly, and you're toggling back and forth like a dance, depending on whether the symptoms are distracting you or whether you can just stay very focused and engaged in what you're doing in a sort of effortless way. So that's how I think about the skills. You could look at, what do I mean by skills? I've got video on that and other things here. Um, but in these situations, there can be some specific considerations that I like to think about. So I've got a few here, and feel free to, drop questions in the chat bar or, sorry, in the comments bar, if you want me to sort of talk about other specific situations. But, one can be, that this whole breath thing, like panic, can induce this sort of air hunger, suffocation. Certainly, sometimes it can be rapid, shallow breathing and hyperventilation, like the kind of movie panic attack. But that, isn't typically what I see a lot of. It's often more the air hunger and suffocation feeling. And so, obviously, if that happens in a social environment, it can be hard to talk. It can make, you get this sort of hyper awareness on breathing, and it's like you can't get enough breath to talk, and then you kind of breathe in more, and then the whole thing can get into a bit of a cycle that gets worse. So, talking and breath hunger, I think, air hunger are an important consideration. Now, air hunger can happen just all day long, and sometimes it can be a sign of stress, or sometimes it's like an OCD hyper awareness symptom. And that's where we've got to really build up this acceptance of that feeling. So that feeling can be there, and I can really focus on life and accept and allow it to be in the background as I engage in life. But as you're talking, I think sometimes, what happens is, as I said before, I'm not convinced that we can really control this always by controlling the breathing. I often found the more I tried to, get my breathing right, or do these breath techniques or whatever, it just made the whole thing worse, and I felt more suffocated. What I've always found more helpful is if I could be more engaged in what I'm saying and more present with the people I'm talking to, and if I'm listening, I'm really focusing on what they're saying, and I'm maybe even naming back to myself in my head, what they're saying to help me really focus in on it, or I'm engaging and thinking about empathy, thinking about their perspective, or I'm kind of paraphrasing their whole the sort of summary of what they're saying in my head. So you can be using your thinking to help you engage, and as you're talking, you're really trying to focus on what you're saying. And the more present you get with that, actually, the more you forget about your breath, the more it takes care of itself. And I think sometimes you can just be in an anxious state, and your body is more sensitive to any degree of suffocation. Well, it's not really suffocation, but the body's misinterpreting it as suffocation. And so, like, I always felt like there were days when I was really relaxed and I'd be breathing the same and I wouldn't even notice my breathing. And then, if I was in this state at all, it's like it would lock on to it immediately. And really, nothing had changed in my breathing. It was more just my degree of anxiety about it. So I find that getting engaged with people, trying to use that breath hunger as a reminder to be focused and present and accepting of the breath hunger. I think you can slow down. You're talking. I mean, I'm sometimes guilty when I have lots of ideas of I want to talk, and you can sometimes talk quite quickly. And I apologize if I do that on the YouTube channel at all. But that can be helpful sometimes just to slow down, give yourself a break, take your time and really be present with what you're saying. But to some degree, I had to learn to just accept this feeling. And even sometimes now, if I'm doing a workshop or whatever, sometimes I'll feel like it and I aim to just really accept it and really allow it and really be present with people and not fight with it, not wish it away or see it as a problem. Instead, see it as a reminder to be present and engaged and focused. The heart rate, so often we just become hyper aware of the heart rate. We get sort of more anxious. I think heart rate can just come forward more, palpitations can come forward more from hyper awareness, ectopic beats where you feel like you're missing a beat and all this. That can happen from just becoming hyper aware. With all this stuff, obviously, if you've never had a health check or you've never, if you have more severe health symptoms, it's not health anxiety to get that looked at once and to get a decent opinion on it. You obviously move into health anxiety when you start to do that repeatedly and you're hyper aware and worrying and researching online and all of that. And we'll do, more stuff on health anxiety. I've done a bit on that, but something I experienced a lot of was health anxiety, and that there's a lot we have to do there. But I just got to put that caveat in because different people listening to the video, and sometimes people, need to just have one physical health check to make sure everything's okay. But that's going to map onto, more wider symptom profile and risk factors and things like that. So assuming that's not the case, often the heart issues again is the same. It's the monitoring and hyper awareness that creates the issues. And so the more we can accept our heart rate, if it is palpitations and we can kind of hear it or feel it, if it feels like it's erratic, if it's, there's a sense of dread with it, or there's tightness, tension in the heart area or chest area, the more we can accept all of that and, not, don't think that you're suddenly going to not be aware of your body and you're going to miss a health symptom. I mean, we really are into health anxiety a bit more here, which as I say, I'll cover more. But generally people sort of worry if I stop monitoring it, I'm gonna miss something. But that's not the case, actually. I think we get better data when we're not hyper focused on our body, when we're aware and we can be mindful and notice things and engage out. And it's not like you focus out and you'll totally lose your body, but we can acknowledge and not monitor it, because if you monitor it, you can just generate pain from being hyper focused and tight. You can start to manifest all these symptoms that feel like genuine health issues, which can be a big thing when you have the sort of fear of death type panic attack or fear of heart issues. So you need to learn to acknowledge and accept the heart beating and then focus and engage and be present in your life. And then you'll know if something is more severe. If you really get a increasing of intensity in symptoms, if you get a wider profile of symptoms, if other people could notice the symptoms, it's a whole different matter. But typically with panic, it's none of that. And we're really just getting hyper focused on body sensations and amplifying them. The same with our mind. If our mind's racing and we're worried about going mad, well, to leave the mind alone, to acknowledge and accept it and not hyper focus on it and get the attention out, we're going to really see that that is just an anxious symptom of our mind kind of racing rather than a sign of impending madness. Um, and the fear of embarrassment. Well, the more we are able to acknowledge these symptoms and focus out, the more control we can have during a panic attack. Like for me, my first panic attacks as a kid, you would feel immobilized and kind of, I would curl up as a ball, and a parent or caregiver had to sort of soothe me. But then, as you build acceptance and tolerance, you realize, like, even in the panic state, I can move my arms and legs, I can focus, I can engage, I can take action. The more confidence you get in that, the more you realize you're not going to be immobilized by panic, and you can accept it. And I mean, we never have absolute certainty, but you start to get the experience that I can accept this, I can get through this, I can keep action orientated, I keep talking, I might slow down a bit, I might feel a bit tighter, I might think my voice sounds very anxious, but I can slow down and I can control my actions, my words, the way I'm talking, my body, my attention. The more confidence you get in that, the more it helps with panic. Yeah, with all the sort of social triggering situations, all the situations we talked about, the sort of big groups or small groups, one-to-one, high stake situations, job interviews, places like this, these sorts of triggering situations. The key thing is bringing our skills in to enable us to be more present with the social situations. So if it's a big group, what am I there for to focus on? If it's one-to-one communication, listening to that person. If it's a higher stakes situation, focused on my goals and my game plan. So trying to really use our ACT skills that we've developed in exposure to be focused and present with people. And we can get better and better at that. The immobilized sort of trapped places, that can be really tough. We can have this fear of being trapped. The dentist, the elevators, the enclosed spaces, these sorts of things. Um, we need to use our skills to try and be present with the situation we're in. This is can be very hard to do, and at the dentist we might have to acknowledge all that intensity of feeling and anxiety and either focus on sometimes if I'm at the dentist, I'm sort of mindful of the process of what they're doing and just listening and focusing on that, or I might be thinking about something I want to do, a plan, a goal, engage with that. So you want to know where you're going to focus in these situations. An elevator, if you're very scared of that, you might be engaged with, the space and noticing the people who are in there with you, or you might be engaged in something you value. Think about, where am I going in this elevator? Where am I going to next? Or you're just practicing your skills as you go up the elevator. Um, in a car and driving, this can be really tough, and there are different levels of severity. And I think I said before, I had a lot of this in driving. And I think at first you drive and you might have had very intense panic attacks, and you think, God, how am I going to be able to drive in that sort of state? And you might have had the panic attacks that really amplified to the point where you feel you can't drive. So and you might have had to pull over, and you might have had to been helped, and things like that, or you might have felt like you weren't as safe. The reality is, actually, anxious drivers, I believe, are safer because it's the people who are not aware of the risk and are multitasking and are sleep deprived and not engaged and focused that are the more risky drivers. Anxious people are going to be slower, more observant of what's going on, more vigilant. Um, and yes, driving is a more dangerous thing we do statistically. It is a bit more challenging, but you can choose to reclaim it if it's important to you and you want to re-engage with driving. And again, it depends where you are in your level of difficulty. For some people, it might be just getting in a car is the first level of exposure. For other people, you might be okay driving around your local area, but it's getting on the motorway, or it's more complex driving or certain situations that are harder. And for some people, it's the social fear of having a panic attack and how embarrassing that would be driving. So you have to sort of map out what your fears are, and is the fear that you couldn't function whilst panicking? And then in which case you need to try to have some experiences of panic attacks in situations outside of driving and learning that you can function, learning that you can feel very, very anxious and still keep moving, keep engaging your focus. And then once you have that, then we want to drive gradually in situations that do induce anxiety and practice attention on driving, practice using our skills and focusing on driving. And for me, I had to learn to drive in depersonalization, so feeling like totally unreal. And like I had times where I was worried I wouldn't be able to judge distance, and my mind was almost convincing me I couldn't judge distance and I couldn't, you know, do this. I was almost forgetting how to drive, or I'd lose the concepts and things like that. And I had to really work hard to acknowledge all of that, refocus on driving, being able to keep my awareness moving from further away to closer to mirrors, and being aware and alert and focused on driving, and obviously anticipating ahead, and um, then accepting. I'm not zooming into my emotions to do a lot of acceptance work whilst driving. I'm doing brief acknowledging of the thoughts, the feelings, and then focusing on driving, and starting with easier stuff and building it up. And then you can do things like go one section of the motorway. You can go with people to build up your confidence, although obviously we want to reduce using the safe people over time. um, and really practice attention. Can I be really focused while driving, even in this high anxiety state? Learn to feel very, very anxious and be very, very focused. And you can do it. I learned to do this, and it gets much, much easier over time. And, I learned to do it when I was, feeling panic and heart pounding. I felt derealized, depersonalized, worried I couldn't judge distance, catastrophic thoughts coming in, feeling like I was going to void my bladder or bowels, all kinds of difficult stuff going on. And I could acknowledge, accept it, and focus on driving. And you can get better and better until you enjoy driving, as I do. Most of the time I enjoy that time in the car, and focused time. And you can then start to listen to stuff again and have conversations, and do all that complex stuff. But we have to sort of build up our skills and our confidence again. I think it's fine to have someone to support you in that, therapist going out with you, or, family members, supportive people, and building it up. In the more you can do, the more you can do, and then trust in that, and then starting to do it on your own, and then starting to do more, and just driving safely, driving to the speed limit, not too fast, not too slow, following all the guidance. And if you haven't driven for a long time, you can always get some top-up lessons and remind yourself of stuff. If you've had decades of not driving, I think that you just need to think for you, what is the way to gradually build it back up in a way that builds my confidence. And for some people, it's very gradual and it will take some time. And for others, you can take more challenges on. And then, there might be challenges with people in the car and different things that make it complicated. Um, and you just need to find ways of working on that gradually. Um, yeah, we want to think about how we withdraw the use of the safe people. So I think some people sometimes need to have that person with them to start doing things. And I think there are certain situations where having a safe person makes sense, like going to a doctor's to advocate for you so that you're not in a doctor's all anxious with potentially a doctor that's less helpful. I have this with clients, sometimes invalidating doctors, and then they're in there very anxious, and having someone with you there to help advocate and help speak for you can help. Now, of course, not all doctors are like this, and I've heard equal accounts of very compassionate doctors. It's a sort of very much a 50-50 thing that I hear with my anxiety and OCD clients. Just today, I heard very, very supportive example. So, it varies greatly. And of course, you can ask for someone else if someone isn't supportive. But over time, you want to gradually withdraw, the use of the safe person so they come along with you for part of it. They're on the phone, then gradually more and more you sort of do it on your own. Things like caffeine, we might want to put it back in if we've taken it out, and you might want to gradually build that back in with, cup of tea first or green tea or something with lower caffeine, and then building back up to coffee. If you value coffee, if it's important. For me, caffeine was a really interesting one because I, before one of my periods of more severe panic and difficulty, I had really gone up to a very large amount of caffeine. I was drinking both British tea, as we all drink it over here, and coffee, and both had crept up quite a bit. And I had very high caffeine tolerance. I didn't even really notice it. And then one day, when the panic set in and the mental health difficulties set in, I couldn't even have a sip of caffeine without my heart starting to go. And it's like my caffeine tolerance went, and it just sent my nervous system very intense right away. And I stopped drinking all coffee, and I stopped alcohol as well at that point. And I think for me, it was important to then bring caffeine back in eventually because I did want to drink coffee and I wanted to enjoy it. It was one of life's pleasures, and I believe that there's a lot of health data that shows, some amount of caffeine, some amount of coffee is good for your brain. Alcohol, I wanted to add in. Alcohol can be one of these things where you use it as a crutch to kind of bring down panic, or other people will avoid it because they're afraid of, feeling like they lose control or the panic after it. You've got to be honest with yourself. Obviously, if you have addictions or any sort of difficulty, that's a whole different matter. And I'm not advocating for anyone to drink a lot of alcohol because obviously nowadays we know it isn't great for our health in any sort of dose, really. Um, but you might want it as part of your culture. It might be part of how you socialize, how you go out with people and eat and drink and stuff. And so it might be important to add it back in. It was for me. I wanted to be able to have a drink with people and have some wine with a meal, have a ice cold beer on a hot day with friends. And so, adding that stuff back in and learning to practice my skills as they changed my physiology, to work with that was important. Um, Invalidating people, this can be a huge thing. You can have judgmental people that make the panic worse. You can have very unsupportive family members and people around you, or cultures or situations that aren't very understanding. And really, this is a massive topic and we could do a whole nother video on it. But I think finding allies, finding advocates, finding other people going through this. Sometimes we have to have boundaries. We have to create space from these people. It's a very complex topic, and I don't want to do, a disservice by not saying much, but I'd say social connection, social support, other advocates, being honest about if someone has been really detrimental to our recovery, perhaps creating space from that person, or building our connection with others. But there's more we could cover on that, and we certainly will talk about that topic more. The embarrassing side effects can be a big part of panic. We're embarrassed that people will see we're panicking. We might have had experiences where it's been embarrassing. Sometimes the whole panic cycle becomes about, I don't want to have a panic attack and embarrass myself here. And I'll be sweating and shaking and going red and being sick, or voiding my bowels in front of people, or bladder, or I'll faint in front of people. Our mind can really worry about these intense symptoms. And sometimes I work with clients, a small subgroup of clients that might have more severe IBS, or other things where they do have to consider this a little bit with health conditions or whatever. But for most people, it's really a story that our mind is telling us, and the antidote is to have this unconditional self-acceptance and self-compassion that says, even if these worst case things happen, even if I do look panicky and anxious, I am going to support myself. I know it doesn't determine my worth. I know there are supportive people out there that will understand this. I know that I can have my own back. I know that I can probably get through these times and these symptoms won't be as severe as I'm worried about. And often people don't notice as much as we predict. And yet, even if they do, if someone judges me, I don't care about that person's point of view. They are not a compassionate person. And I'm going to orientate to the people who are supportive and get this. Um, and because the more we worry about the embarrassment of these symptoms, the more they're going to amplify and show. And I've had a lot of this, loads of times, sort of sweating and going red and feeling like I sounded really anxious in my voice like this, or people could see almost my panic and vulnerability. That drove, I really had all the different panic fears around, death and losing my mind and embarrassment, losing control and being stuck in the symptoms forever, all these different versions of it. And the embarrassment one, for me, unconditional self-compassion, self-acceptance, learning that actually people don't care as much as I think they do. And if they do care, that's a judgmental person that I don't want to put them in charge of my life. Most people are supportive and caring or don't even notice because they're too, focused on their own stuff. So learning that it's okay to be anxious around people, it's okay to sound anxious, to look anxious, to go red, to shake. It can be tricky because sometimes these anxiety symptoms do mean that people don't listen as much to us, or we might get ignored or talked over or other things like that, and that can be tough. But trying to, learn to feel anxious and talk in a calm, focused, present way, take our time if someone keeps talking over us to say, I really want to finish my point here. Can you give me a minute? Um, there might be some social stuff we need to work on with all of this, and you can look at the social skills playlist on the channel for some ideas there. But really learning that even if the worst case happened, it's not as bad as we would fear. People will forget, life will move on. 20 years' time, it will be a funny anecdote. You can cope with it, you can handle it, you can have your own back. You can find people who are supportive no matter what happens. And you actually can feel like you need the loo, or you're going to be sick, or you're going to hyperventilate, or you're going to embarrass yourself some way, you can feel that, accept it, and engage and be present and be really focused. And then that stuff will go into the background and be less problematic. And eventually it may even disappear altogether. But the more we can accept it and stay focused and present. And really, self compassion supports this, using the self compassion skills on this channel to complement this. So as you go into exposure work, you could be using compassionate self-talk as you're facing difficulty. If you have a shameful inner critic voice, you're being very hard on yourself, then working all that self-compassion, learning to be our own inner supportive coach can be hugely supportive. So you can really use the ACT skills together with self-compassion, and that can be a really positive combination. And accepting even if we do get panicky and we feel embarrassed, or accepting if I am a bit anxious, or if I don't manage to do my exposure homework today, or I have a setback, all these different situations, to learn they are a natural part of recovery, and we can be kind and supportive and develop that. And that will help us, because if we're panicking and then someone's being very self-critical next to us, it's only going to stress us and make the symptoms worse. So being a compassionate advocate and support is going to be so much more helpful. Um, couple more things I wanted to say, and then yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions about any of this. So sometimes, I see the fear and panic switching. So it starts with, fear of like I'm dying from these symptoms, then to like, oh, fear I'm gonna go mad, to then I'm gonna embarrass myself, to then, oh, I'm just gonna be stuck in this state and feeling panicky and really anxious all the time is gonna ruin my future. It's a sort of fear of suffering. And we've really just got to be ready to use our skills with all of those different versions if it does jump around and change. And sometimes the actual panic symptoms change. Sometimes, we I had a long time where it's more my heartbeat and, real nauseous feelings in my stomach and knots and butterflies in my stomach and, kind of not so much in my chest, like more my heart, um, and dizziness and depersonalization. And then the symptoms sort of switched, and I started having more breath hunger, and some other stuff and dizziness and different ways the symptoms can move around. So you have to be ready that sometimes it's like your body is going, oh, he's not reacting to the stomach being in knots anymore. Okay, that's will generate some anxiety in the chest. Okay, that's good. That's getting him to avoid. So it's almost, I mean, I don't think anxiety is literally as conscious as that. I think it's just our threat system is trying what it can to get us to avoid. And sometimes we're just becoming anxious about different parts of the system and then they amplify. But just being ready for those symptoms to move around as well. And this can be all the resistance, all the difficulty as we're trying to push into it. It switches form, it intensifies, it worries about other things, the critic comes in, or sometimes it switches to depression. So we stop being panicky and then we feel depressed. So just ready to work our skills on any way it switches, any resistance. I think that sometimes the difficulty with panic is having to do continuous practice over a long period of time. Like for me, the biggest help when I was really suffering was, okay, wake up with a panic attack, skills right away, rolling high anxiety and then panic throughout the day, just using my skills all day long, like I've described in this video. And that was really the most helpful thing. But that's a very hard thing for people to do. Like you try and get on a plane and you're going to have 8 hours of having to practice skills the whole time is what I had to do, or long car journeys or long train journeys or something. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of us, that is what we have to do. It's not as simple as like a 20-minute exposure and it's gone. Sometimes you have to be really ready to work these skills across a whole day. So you could look at the videos on continuous skills on the channel and some ideas on that. Um, but everyone I've ever worked with panic underestimates their strength. They have a vulnerable self-concept, and we need to switch that to a resilient sense of self where you can handle this stuff, or at least you can practice and build up handling this stuff and get better and better and build your confidence and your self-efficacy in the sense that I can do things to help me when I feel like this. And then when you really get a high degree of acceptance and you're really good at functioning with the symptoms, yeah, they typically come down, become more transient, may even go dormant, may even, go disappear. But that will happen, I believe, paradoxically, in direct correlation to your degree of acceptance. So that's the frustrating thing in mental health recovery. It's often the degree of acceptance predicts the degree of reduction. And so when you have highest acceptance, you don't really need the symptoms to reduce, and that's when they reduce more. But that can go up and down. You can get high acceptance and then it dwindles away a little bit. The symptoms come up. So you just need to constantly be working on, my degree of ability to accept this panic, let it be in the background as I focus foreground on values and life. The better you get at that, the easier it will get. And it's tough, but I'm someone who's had a lifetime of panic and very intense periods with it, and you really can get better. I wouldn't say I experience panic attacks now. I can have very high anxiety still. At times, I can certainly before something challenging or in certain contexts can feel higher anxiety, but I can use my skills through that, and it doesn't then amplify up into a full panic attack. It's just more transient experience. Or if anticipatory anxiety stays around for longer or something like that, it's okay. That can be there, and I will focus and engage in what I value. And I think that's a realistic recovery. I think anyone that's saying you can regulate this away or reprocess or get rid of this by doing some sort of therapy, I would want to see the evidence. I think the real recovery comes from a high degree of acceptance and better functioning in panic, and then symptoms get easier. And I think that's what you hear when you read people's recovery stories about panic, and you hear other people that have recovered from panic, other inspirational people, so often it's about acceptance, about skills, about ability to function with it, about reclaiming your life, about exposure, but not a simple exposure which gives you a predictable reduction in symptoms. It's more an expansion in life. And then over time, that produces, more transient, less intense symptoms, but only as you accept it more. And that's what I've seen in my own life and seeing clients. And people who struggle with panic for a long time are often the people who don't want to accept it. They don't want any degree of this and they really don't want to feel it at all. And my heart goes out to people in that place. And I felt like that, in the past. But the more you choose to willingly feel this and to push into it and to take control of your life, the better it will get. And everyone listening to this can do that. Everyone can do that. It just takes practice and hard work. So yeah, reach out to a therapist if you're struggling with panic. Don't do it on your own if you are struggling with working on recovery. But hopefully some ideas in this video will be helpful. And if you have any questions about panic, do put them in the comments below.